Well, thank you guys for joining us. I'm really excited to be here for this event. We are now doing a special live recording episode of our series, Countering Chinese Communist Party Influence Around the World. And we're especially thankful for our partners today at the Heritage Foundation for co-hosting the event. This is the final episode of this series. So for those of you who have not been watching the series, or even those of you who have, in the Vandenberg Coalition's Countering CCP Influence series, we spoke with leading experts on issues ranging from CCP influence in outer space, international organizations, as well as Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, Europe, the Indo-Pacific, and South Asia. So basically covering the world. And in each installment, we were focused on discussing China's growing influence, how it threatens American interests, and what America can and should be doing in the face of these threats. However, the rise of China is really not just a foreign policy concern. From nefarious behavior like catalyzing America's synthetic opioid crisis to influencing and interfering in American schools, America is facing mounting threats from the CCP's aggressive geopolitical agenda. And that's what we're here to discuss today. Essentially, the CCP's threat here domestically inside the United States. So to discuss these issues, I'm really excited and proud to introduce our panel. So first we have Bryan Burack, who's the Senior Policy Advisor for China and the Indo-Pacific at the Heritage Foundation's Asian Studies Center. We also have Michele Exner, Senior Advisor at Parents Defending Education. Brian Cavanaugh, Senior Vice President at American Global Strategies and a visiting fellow at Heritage. We have lots of senior folks here, I'm seeing. And Jackie Deal, the co-founder of the American Academy for Strategic Education. So thank you guys for joining today. So I just want to say to the audience first, we're going to do the recording, and then we'll stop the recording and then go to some live Q&A from all of you. So really appreciate your being here. Okay, so I want to ask kind of a level-setting question. As we've discussed throughout the series, the CCP is actively working to replace the United States' position in the world and position China as the world's dominant power. So I'd like to kind of ask this to each of you in turn. From your perspective, what are the primary sectors for CCP influence within the United States, and how do you see that as playing within their larger strategy?
Yeah, happy to. I think my perspective from this comes from several years on Capitol Hill, and it was quite interesting to see how CCP influence has influenced and shaped that debate. From my perspective, they have been relatively successful in creating an environment where taking action against legitimate national security threats is seen as something that is sensitive or sort of not the norm, that we need to break from or prevail over these potential concerns in order to take action to protect our national security. Obviously, that shouldn't really be the case. I'll get specific, right? Like, over the last several years, we've seen increasing efforts from Congress to come together on large, multi-topic, widespread pieces of China legislation. This has generally not succeeded, but pieces of it will eventually be incorporated into legislation that passes. And in each of those cases, we've seen a constellation of either outright united front groups or fellow travelers or just kind of like-minded entities try to cast these efforts as exclusionary or xenophobic or what have you. And we're really talking about things that have nothing to do with, individual liberties here in the United States, but generally relate to like the governance of foreign policy authorities, sanctions authorities, et cetera. So that's, one thing to think about. And then obviously today we have, a wide number of potential threats that are related to CCP influence in the United States. I think like what we've seen over the last couple of years is that at the state government level, the biggest thing that is energizing state legislatures right now is the issue of a largely unregulated acquisition of real property by, either Chinese individuals or companies, and the lack of transparency and information we have associated with that. Obviously, at the federal level, we have this gigantic ongoing debate regarding TikTok. So it's quite multifaceted, but maybe I'll just leave it there, and I'm sure the other panelists have things to say as well.
Michele.
Thanks, Carrie. I think the better question is, what sector of our society are they not trying to exploit, right? So farmland, our police department, our military. Just last fall, there was a reporting from the Wall Street Journal saying that there were 100 Chinese nationals trying to enter our U.S. military bases. So I'm here with Parents Defending Education. So we've also seen them trying to exploit K-12 classrooms. We know they're higher ed. TikTok, yes, it's not, I know the debate has been like, oh, but free speech. Yeah, but what if it's a foreign country now trying to influence the content that our youth are consuming? That seems like a big deal to me. And so I think, I think it's so expansive that perhaps most Americans don't, they're going through their day-to-day lives and don't understand just how wide their reach is, and it's all to achieve their strategic objectives of trying to take us over as a global superpower. So it's pretty frightening.
Okay, thanks, Michele. Bryan.
Thank you, Carrie. First, I think just the arrogance in how they write and speak about this in their own doctrine. To touch it, it's every sector, yes. But let's bucket in three categories here. You have the commerce side domestically that we're confronting this economic coercion, how they undercut the markets and kind of infiltrate the markets, take over markets, and eliminate competition. You look at the societal piece and how they're doing malign misinformation that goes from TikTok to using the other social media platforms, similar to how we saw Russia do it in the early 2010s. China's actually perfected it, and then they came out with a platform of their own, and it's now widely used in this country. And then lastly, critical infrastructure. If you want to force an opinion or influence a population, hold their day-to-day needs at bay. So we've seen that kind of go through those three categories where they're threatening the commerce and infiltrating the economic space to the government sector. What you saw was this huge effort to kind of coerce and kind of influence D.C. politics on a national level. Over the last decade, maybe more, they've moved away from that and decided we're going to surround the states, get the states to pass legislation that's favorable to us, develop these long, enduring relationships, and as those members go into federal politics, we have a hold on them, we have influence on them. So there's those four categories out there is where they're going.
Great. Jackie.
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. I agree with what my panelists have said. And just to put a point on Bryan's last remark, in 2016, a famous Chinese Communist Party scholar, academic, and advisor on the United States to the party gave a speech in which he calculated or estimated the amount of votes it would take to swing congressional elections in every legislative district across the country. And then he said, based on my estimate, this is actually a feasible task for us to swing these elections and then kind of own the politicians going forward. So there's definitely a tension, at all the national levels that were mentioned and at the subnational, state and local level. And I guess it's important to recognize that this is maybe a different kind of competition for the United States, therefore. We're used to, from the Cold War, thinking about militaries and conventional military power, strategic competition, nuclear weapons. We're a little less accustomed to thinking about an adversary that even before military power places kind of infiltrative power, subversion power, espionage and covert action and propaganda kind of at the primary place of its strategy. But we know Xi Jinping, like Mao before him, talks about three magic weapons for the party. And the first one is united front work. So that's more this kind of influence, interference, operations on the ground in the United States and other places of interest to the party state. So we have to kind of keep in mind this is a new or a different kind of challenge for us. And I guess as a sign of how much work we have to do, I think it's a shame that this administration has reverted to calling Xi Jinping President Xi, because I think that's very confusing in the context of this kind of very different political system, very different kind of strategic competition. Xi Jinping is not the choice of the Chinese people. He was even a contested choice within the Chinese Communist Party. So we shouldn't do him the honor of calling him the president. We should call him the general secretary, because that's how he is known within China, and that's his most important title.
Thank you. I definitely want to get into the state influence, because I think, in our conversations with state leaders, they've often been sort of surprised that they're being targeted. They assume that, it's being directed at the federal government. But before we do, Jackie, I want to stick with you and ask, when we look at both the Trump administration's pillars of approaches to China, as well as the Biden administration's, it strikes me that the first one listed is always strengthening institutions at home. The Trump administration said that was, quote, to improve the resiliency of our institutions, alliances, and partnerships. Biden's strategy begins with, quote, to invest in the foundations of our strength at home. And so come 2024, how do you think either a Trump 2 or a Biden 2 administration should be thinking about the federal level's approach to China? What would you be recommending they do differently?
Well, I think both administrations have gone some distance. Really, the Trump administration first, made a point of saying to the American people, all is not right with our relationship with China. I think the president's way of saying it is we're getting a bad deal. But you then saw speeches from the highest levels, the vice president, the FBI director, the Secretary of State. Those were all very important messages informing the American people of what's going on and what's at stake. The Deputy National Security Advisor also gave speeches in Chinese, sort of taking it to the Chinese people. And there's been some of that kind of continuing in this administration, but I think there's much more work to be done to kind of clarify, educate the American people, and lead on this subject. We've seen Congress do it from the Select Committee on China, but there's some questions about, I guess, the future of that committee in a new Congress. So, I think the first thing is to explain, use the bully pulpit, use the highest offices of the land, congressional leaders too, explain what's going on. This is, again, from the Chinese Communist Party's perspective, an existential fight. They think of it in terms of, you die, I live, or the reverse. And I don't know that we've had enough kind of leadership at the highest level on that. And also on this issue of, this is not just about, obviously the military competition is important, the strategic and the conventional military competition, but this is also in many ways a sub-conventional competition and an economic competition and a technological competition. And that means we have to think very differently about, the asymmetry between our openness and their closure.
Well, and I think the idea of explaining to the American people is so important. And one thing that I remember Secretary Pompeo did that he got criticized for was going into the individual states and sort of explaining what threat the Chinese Communist Party really poses. And I suspect that part of why polling shows that Americans are concerned about the CCP more so than Russia, more so than other adversaries, is because there has been some effort to try to make the case. One area that I think people are trying to make the case on now, and most of you mentioned this, was TikTok. So right now we have, last Wednesday, the House passed a bill that would ban TikTok from U.S. apps if the app remains controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. So it's not a ban, it's just asking for, divesting from Chinese ownership. Bryan, since I realize we have two Bryans, Bryan with a Y, can you sort of lay out the scope of the problem that we're seeing with apps like TikTok, and sort of what information exactly is the CCP gaining access to that we should be so worried about?
Yeah, sure. It's a multifaceted problem in the sense that this has basically been a cancer that's been allowed to grow because we don't have the tools to come to grips with it. When it comes to this particular app, it exists in its current form because it was approved. There's a transaction approved by CFIUS that allowed ByteDance to acquire an American app. There's obviously, concern regarding that process. Obviously, given its outcome, when it became even more apparent that it was an issue, I think the United States basically found itself without appropriate tools to come to grips with it, in the sense that we can't use sanctions authorities because there's an amendment that exists in law that has been broadly interpreted to prevent really any action against some things that would affect data flows. And that has basically left us disarmed against 100 million CCP-controlled sensors distributed throughout the United States that know everything about their users, from GPS location data to keystroke logging, et cetera. And many of my colleagues here at Heritage have done a much better job than I can do in actually laying out specifically what are the threats from the app itself and its install base and its presence on your phone. But fundamentally, the challenge remains that we are, as a government, ill-equipped to contend with it currently, and that is what has led to the current debate in Congress. And it's quite disheartening because you've seen basically every powerful individual in our country basically agree about the threat, from President Trump to President Biden's White House, which is currently working seemingly productively with Congress on this particular authority, to Leader Schumer himself. There's been clips resurfacing of how clear-minded he spoke about this issue. So that's kind of where we stand. It's essentially incredibly low-hanging fruit. And hopefully Congress can get this done, because honestly, if we cannot deal with this incredibly manifest threat, it's hard to see how we can do things that are even harder. Because throughout this process, I mean, TikTok has demonstrated some of the concerns that we are most concerned with. It's a matter of record that the CCP has used its access to this spy network to, for example, monitor and track journalists already. We know that that's happened. And as a part of its lobbying against this particular bill, TikTok has shown us that it's perfectly capable and willing to do some of the other things that we're concerned that it can do, like lie to the American people and interfere with the processes of our government, which is something that it is obviously clearly done by its engagement using the app itself against this piece of legislation. So I'm hoping we can get it done, because this is really only the tip of the iceberg. Obviously, there are many other non-social media apps that present, honestly, some of the same concerns. Shopping apps, for example, have similarly huge install bases in the United States and are similarly legally obligated to help the CCP's intelligence agencies in their activities against us. And we still have some of these existing hurdles, even if this current legislation passes, that would prevent the use of other national security tools from being used against some of these threats, such as the Berman Amendment, which prevents us from using our usual sanctions tools. So it's an important fight, and it's absolutely critical to get this done, to prove that we can do the most basic things that we need to do, because this is just the start.
If I may, Carrie, just to add to both responses so far, and I think what Jackie said is really poignant, that we have to do a great job of educating. And I think, if you look at 2017 to 2024, the last 7 years, we've done a great job at the leadership level of communicating to the American public. The awareness and polling would suggest across the country there's a much greater understanding and awareness of the threat amongst the civilian population outside of the national security policy space in D.C. However, I think there's also a failure in leadership and government to understand some of the tools that they have within their toolbox, so to speak. You look at the Department of Homeland Security, created in 2003 after 9/11. One of its initial components was the Office of Intelligence and Analysis, and it's gone astray. A lot of people have called for the dissolvement of INA. It's stood up misinformation boards. It grew from 40 personnel to over 500 personnel. It's kind of out there without a mission, but Congress authorized an extremely clear mission for Office of Intelligence and Analysis, and that was to be the conduit to take threat information and share it with state and local governments, law enforcement entities, and those that can act on it. In the last 6 months, I've spent a lot of time at the state level talking to state legislatures. There is not an awareness of what the threat actually is. They hear the message, but how are they supposed to write legislation, vote on legislation, absent an understanding of what the threat means? What does it look like to them? What's it look like in their state? So when I think of it as leadership and government has kind of failed to recognize this tool and to take it and say, okay, we should have this unclassified. I'm not recommending state legislature get clearances, unrealistic. But what you could do is have an organization within DHS that's charged to go out and carry that message at an unclassified level, give them the threat briefings, help them understand that space. Instead, on Monday, Jake Sullivan sent a signed letter to governors across the country articulating a threat to water treatment facilities, signed with the EPA administrator. No one from DHS is on that letter. Jenny Easterly from Critical Infrastructure, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency is not on that letter. So it's like a whole lapse that they don't even acknowledge that DHS has a role in this space. In fact, when you talk to folks at the state level, most of them have a very negative opinion of the Environmental Protection Agency and what it means to their community's economic development. So interesting space. Just wanted to highlight that there are tools out there to kind of hit that next level of awareness, and we're just glossing over it.
Well, whenever we talk about youth, it obviously makes me think about education. And so, Michele, Parents Defending Education is sort of all about empowering parents to be involved in and heard in the education of their children. So can you kind of walk us through how the CCP's influence is affecting the American educational system, both at the K through 12 level, but also kind of the higher education level?
Sure. Okay, so I'll start in K to 12. That's the scope of Parents Defending Education. So last March, we put out an initial report focused on Thomas Jefferson High School, which is just across the river over in Fairfax County, is one of the top high schools in the country. And we found out that there was at that point $1 million of Chinese money that had funneled into this school over the course of 9 years, right? That's a pretty big deal. And so fast forward, we said, well, okay, if that's happening in one school, how many other schools is this happening in across the country? So we put out a larger report over the summer in July that shows the problem is quite alarming. There were actually 143 school districts across the country that received about $18 million of China-linked funding. And so I'm sure most of this is branded to parents and schools. We will give your children cultural training and language immersion. That sounds wonderful, right? But again, it would be naive for us to think that China has any incentive to help the next generation of American students. No, in fact, it's probably just to make them more amenable to the China's interests, both domestically and both here and abroad. And so we work to expose that, right? We work to both at the federal level and state level. And so luckily on the federal level, we've been able to now get 3 pieces of legislation introduced both in the Senate and House. So Senator Rubio introduced a Protecting Education from Malign Foreign Influence Act that actually focuses on both K-12 and higher ed, so hits both of those aspects there. And then last September, we had Representative Stefanik, David Joyce of Ohio, and also Ed Case. So we got a Democrat on there, which is, as you guys can tell from the political dynamic, that is actually quite a feat. And so that was combating the lies of authoritarians in school systems, so the Class Act, and that banned school districts from accepting any funds that are connected to the CCP. And then we also had Representative Kevin Hearn, who oversees the Republican Study Committee. He introduced Promoting Responsible Oversight to Eliminate Communist Teachings for Our Kids, to Protect Our Kids Act. And so we see that as a pretty big deal. I know with, again, Senator Schumer over on the Senate, I'm not sure if this will get to a Senate vote to pass Congress, but it should, right? This is a big deal. This has nothing to do, I think sometimes we see Democrats pose this as, well, it's racist. There's nothing racist about this, right? And in fact, when a president of our organization was a witness at a hearing on this specific issue back in September, I would say every Democrat member who asked her a question all went back to the same thing. This is racism. It has nothing to do with that. We have evidence that shows that they're just trying to steal our information, right? And I know that back in 2019, there was an FBI report that talked about the dangers of China infiltration of college campuses, right? And so I think the K-12 side is just them trying to do it in just another sector. And so anyway, big deal there. We think parents should be concerned because it raises a lot of questions, right? Are they manipulating? These are, in some instances, teachers that are vetted by the Chinese Communist government that are then going into our schools, right? So are they manipulating the information that students are getting? Did Tiananmen Square exist, right? Did that happen in these teachings? Do these individuals have access to data servers, right? Schools aren't able to protect data, student data as it is, and now you're going to have this potential foreign entity going in and stealing that information. So are teacher and student data at risk of espionage? And oh, by the way, we have also found throughout our research that these Confucius classrooms, so Confucius Institutes, higher ed, Confucius classrooms at the K-12 level, so 30 of these are actually near major military installations. So I don't want to say that's on accident. I would say it's probably quite purposeful from the CCP. And so Yes, and during a House Select Committee on the CCP hearing last month, there were national security officials who discussed the CCP's cyber threat to the American homeland. And so PDE sent a letter to all the superintendents of the 34 states and Washington, D.C., who all had this China-linked funding. And I also want to end with So Thomas Jefferson, I want to end with that because through more research and more FOIAs that we got back, we actually found that it was $3.4 million, okay? We were able to see, it's all online if you want to see, email exchanges between Thomas Jefferson teachers and staff and the Chinese officials, right? It was quite obvious what they were getting at. Oh, give us your lesson plan. Can we see your curriculums? Can we see the student projects? They actually handed over student projects. But this is what, again, I think now it's dropped, probably for bad press, to about the seventh best high school in the country. And here's the kicker. There are now 20 Thomas schools in China based on our model over here. So we're creating these great, very innovative schools for our students, and then China's just stealing them. And so anyway, something for all parents to be aware of.
Yeah, Jackie.
Can I just pick up on something that Michele was mentioning, which I think is very important for people to understand? It's not racist to be in favor of freedom and rights for people from China. In fact, the greatest source of anti-Asian hate in the world right now is probably the Chinese Communist Party regime, which has taken away the freedom of the people of Hong Kong, is threatening the freedom of the people in Taiwan, has committed what two successive secretaries of state have labeled a genocide, correctly called a genocide in Xinjiang in Western China, is clearly trying to extend the long arm of Beijing's repression and security state over what Xi Jinping calls the quote unquote the sons and daughters of China everywhere, whether they're citizens of other countries or not. This is a major threat to people of Chinese background. And so, the U.S. policy is to try to make the United States, ensure that the United States remains free for people from all countries, and that people have rights and that they're able to engage in free expression. And the threat on our to our schools and our campuses is real. There's countless examples of Chinese students worrying about being surveilled, being threatened, being harassed. So there's a real issue here where in the United States, people are not getting the American, they're not getting American free values of education, free expression, free inquiry, and this is extremely dangerous and pernicious, and we should not be distracted by claims that it's racist or we are guilty of anti-Asian hate for trying to protect people. This is, it's very disturbing that people are confused about this. It's kind of a fundamental issue, and we know from Australian examples that this is actually a line that's being propagated by China through United Front operatives. So it's not an accident that when we try to defend people and their rights, we're being accused of being racist.
Well, there's been numerous examples of that where valedictorians or salutatorians will give speeches, Chinese students praising the American system. Reports on them being surveilled, harassed, their parents back home in China being surveilled and harassed. So thank you for raising that. I want to stick with you, Jackie, because something that comes up very regularly, and Michele alluded to this question of land grabs, right? Like Chinese companies and organizations purchasing either American agricultural land. And why are they doing that? What's going on? Why should we be concerned about that?
Okay, that's a great question. And in some cases, as Michele mentioned, these, and I think Bryan said this as well. Actually, both Bryan said this. They're purchasing real property in the United States because of the proximity to sensitive military facilities, test ranges for new military platforms, proximity to critical infrastructure. So therefore, the ability to use sensors or cyber tools to interfere with, either military or civilian activities in the United States. In other cases, it's about espionage. So, co-location with labs that are doing breakthrough research enables, the prying eyes of China's espionage apparatus to gain access to critical know-how as it's being developed, or recruit what they would call, talent people on site here in the United States. So I guess there's also a concern about on the agricultural land front, their ability to interfere with, our food production. So there's the intellectual property that goes into, how we do fertilizers and how we do our agribusiness. And then there's the concern that they may be able to tamper with our soil or basic elements of our cropland and our harvests. And so there's just a whole slate of issues, a spectrum of issues there. And I think, one way to summarize it is it's about espionage, and it's also about leverage. If we think that we are somehow threatened or dependent on China exposed in these areas, that I think for our decision makers, at the highest levels, in states or at the national level, their hands will be somewhat tied in the face of, or at least the theory from Beijing would be, we will be inhibited from, scared to take action in response to Chinese aggression. I think that's a bad bet, but I worry that that's part of what's driving all of this activity on the ground in the United States.
And is the solution there at the state or the federal level? Like, is there a way to regulate this or ban this?
Well, that's a complicated question. I think states properly have the ability and the right to protect their people and their infrastructure. There is the federal prerogative when it comes to foreign policy. So it's a question of, if states make laws that interfere with the federal government's responsibility to conduct international relations, those laws could be preempted. But if the states make laws that are consistent with their obligation to protect their population and their infrastructure, then that's how the framers intended states to operate. So right now, I guess Bryan and I have been involved in going to states and working with their legislatures to try to help them understand the threat and help them protect their population and their infrastructure. And we found, we have been inspired, I guess it's safe to say, by the kind of bipartisan support for those bills and the good faith of the legislatures. So I think there is a role for the states, but as we've seen with, the TikTok bill that's been discussed already, there's also a role for the federal government in certain areas.
Yeah. One of the things I think that's inspired me that I've seen states do is states always ask us as DC policy experts, well, we don't want to infringe on that foreign affairs aspect that is really the federal government's role. How can we do this legislation in a meaningful way that stays in alignment with the laws? And it's, for me, it's been really inspiring because we were able to help point out to federal regulations and other laws where we articulate who our foreign adversaries are. And instead of by naming them by name, you just say, in accordance with the federal law that's covering this section, those countries will be prohibited from doing X, Y, and Z. And then it kind of takes the states out of this infringement space, and they're just adhering to what's being federally recognized already.
And Bryan, what are you seeing as sort of like the key issues that the states are concerned about? So we've already touched on the sort of land grabs, but you had mentioned earlier in your remarks this idea of critical infrastructure. So what are state leaders most concerned about Chinese influence in that case? Is it cyber attacks on sort of like water supplies? Like, what does it look like?
I think it differs as you talk to different individuals at the state level. So I'd say for some, you have a category, I'd say they're very concerned with espionage, and they may have a misunderstanding of what espionage is. Again, the people at the state legislature are coming up from a day job where they're either a rancher or a farmer or they work as an accountant. That international policy, national security, tradecraft is not something that they understand. So they'll hear the alarmist thing and go down some really interesting paths. And I think our role is to kind of help keep them between the guardrails and not get off the road. But then there's others who actually have a pretty firm understanding of, I've already seen where they've bought up all this agriculture land, and now instead of it being sold within our economy here, it's being shipped immediately overseas. So we're losing out on the opportunity to buy from our own backyard within our own state, something that we had previously relied on. So they're seeing it from a threat to food security, quite frankly, that's a pretty mature look at the agriculture aspect, and something that I don't think the federal government has expounded on in a meaningful way. In fact, if you look at the National Security Policy Memoranda on food food and agriculture security, it's always through the lens of a chemical attack. It's not through what happens in a land acquisition or business acquisition of companies that are in the food processing industry. So it's interesting to see that. But I'd say, again, the level of understanding is very much a baseline. And if we're going to confront this challenge domestically, we need to do a better job of bringing the level of awareness and education up across the board.
Jackie.
Yeah, just to build on that, and what I should have mentioned also, another concern with the agricultural land purses is that they've become a vector for organized crime, illegal activity related to drugs and human trafficking. And there have been stories everywhere from, Oklahoma to Maine to other states across our union of land purchases where marijuana is being grown, and then there's triads, criminal gangs out of China are engaged in illegal activity associated with the marijuana, and also, again, potentially human trafficking on those sites. I remember hearing from somebody in Oklahoma that usually in Oklahoma, when you travel around agricultural land farms, it's sort of like you can walk anywhere, and then you go down certain roads now, and you see these armed guards, and they're protecting Chinese-owned land, and they're pointing guns at you if you threaten to trespass, because who knows what's going on those properties, and that's not the Oklahoma way, and that's not the American way.
Bryan, I want to ask you about a recent report that Heritage put out, which was a comprehensive agenda that was outlining the steps necessary to counter China. And one of the things that it focused on was how many public employee pension funds, state-funded university pensions, and so on, hold sizable Chinese equities and bonds. So can you talk about what kind of influence that gives the CCP?
Yeah, I think that when it comes to the issue, these are essentially, this is what we're talking about in regards to pension fund investments. This is one form of a larger issue, which is the fact that there are few to no restrictions on United States investments in PRC companies. The thing that is immediately the most striking is that in many cases, the United States capital is being used to develop Chinese military capabilities. So right off the bat, obviously, we know that is a problem. It gives them influence in the sense that these are capabilities that will be turned against United States soldiers, and American financiers are helping develop these things. When it comes to more, I think, closer to what we're talking about in terms of domestic influence, it is very clear that the financial service industry likes being able to play in the space that it does, in the sense of helping Chinese companies list on our markets, helping to bundle Chinese investments together with other investments and get fees that way, selling the China story, which is increasingly maybe oversold about what an incredible opportunity the Chinese market is, et cetera. So we have this entrenched industry now that has a strong financial incentive to continue directing United States capital into Chinese capabilities, without regard to whether or not they present national security threats. So it was very noteworthy that in the report you're mentioning, which is I believe our Winning the New Cold War paper, which I think is a pretty landmark shift for Heritage on China policy generally, one of the most noteworthy aspects of that was our new position on outbound investment restriction. And that has been a space that we've continued to be very active in all year, as first, the administration finally released a delayed executive order that would start to take baby steps to coming to grip with this problem. And more recently, Congress has had a very robust debate about how to start legislating on this issue, which is still going to be required. So essentially where we stand now is that we had a very good opportunity at the end of last year to begin legislating on some transparency for these investment flows into the PRC. One of the major issues being that the government has no ability to even really know what type of United States capital flows are going on and what entities that they're directed to. So Congress was poised to create such a requirement through legislation. It was killed by basically the House Financial Services Committee chair objecting to the inclusion of that piece of legislation in a final defense bill. So coming into the spring, this is still a live issue that's incredibly important. And obviously the China reporting cadre in DC they're writing all their stories on TikTok, but we really shouldn't forget that this is the other major China debate that is live and needs to be figured out as soon as possible, because literally helping the Chinese military fund our own destruction is something that we really should be concerned with.
Yeah, Jackie, based on this and, seeing the recent reports that the CCP might be increasing its defense expenditures by something like 7.2% in this upcoming year. So I'm curious, can you kind of elaborate on what the CCP's objectives and long-term goals are for their military? And how should the U.S. think about our own? Obviously, we have to think about the money that we're sending to them to increase those capabilities, but how should we be thinking about our own defense in light of this increase?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, the Army is another one of the magic weapons, and arguably we've been, a little bit too passive or inertial in the face of what has been the most rapid and significant increase in military spending in peacetime the world has seen since at least the interwar period before World War II that the PLA has undertaken over the last 2 decades. So, we're barely kind of moving forward or keeping pace with inflation in our defense spending. We've seen the PLA build up so dramatically that it's now reportedly ahead of us in certain key areas. It can make, certain kind of hypersonic weapons, fractional orbital bombardment systems, all kinds of missiles that, potentially we can't make or aren't making, have chosen not to make. We're used to hearing that our military, that we spend more on defense than the next 10 countries combined, but that's a bit misleading at this point, again, in the face of this tremendously rapid and significant buildup in certain areas. The PRC, the dollar value of what they're spending on the military is more than what we're spending. And that goes for probably missiles, probably certain kind of long-range transports, and military construction, the way that they're hardening and tunneling and fortifying their facilities is something, again, that's, probably you've only seen in sci-fi movies. I take Xi at his word when he says things like, in the Korean War, we had less steel but more energy, and today we have more steel and more energy and stronger bones. And we've accomplished certain key missions in military reforms, and he's kind of contracting the timelines or setting new goals from 2049 back to 2035, back to 2027 for the PLA to become a world-class power. I think what that means in Beijing is they'll be able to call the shots, and other countries will defer or have to kind of, be conciliatory in the face of increasingly stringent, aggressive Chinese moves and demands, because they will be faced with, the specter of, again, this very impressive-looking new, well-equipped PLA. Now, obviously, there are questions, if we look under the surface, how good are the people? How good are the logistics and the sustainment and the maintenance? There are lots of questions we can ask, but just looking at the procurement, probably, I think I wrote a couple of years ago that it looked like the lines were going to cross, within the president's first term, and maybe it looks like, that will hold true, or at least sometime this decade, the dollar value of what they're procuring will exceed the dollar value of what we're procuring for our military, period. So we're spending a lot, yes, but we're spending on other categories, and they're spending on weapons. So we haven't seen anything like this, and we have to take, I think, much more dramatic steps to, at least keep pace or prepare for, again, this very different kind of military challenge than what we've been doing in the last decade or two.
So speaking of calling the shots, one of the things that I've been concerned with for quite some time is that through the CCP, Chinese-controlled state enterprises are rapidly gaining control of the critical mineral supply chain around the world. And so these are, this includes materials that are necessary not just for key sort of consumer interests like phones and computers, but also for key national security products and equipment, even things as basic as ammunition. So, Bryan, I'd love to hear from you. What does this dependency on a CCP-controlled critical mineral supply chain mean both for U.S. businesses as well as for U.S. national security?
I mean, if you take a look at what they were able to do with their Belt and Road Initiative in terms of how they dealt with third world countries and gaining access to mining rights to rare minerals that I think the rest of the world was just not abjectly paying attention to. So now you have China with access to 72 to 76%, depending on whose numbers you look at, of the rare earth minerals on the globe. They are responsible for.
Can you just quickly just say what why rare earths are a thing people should know about?
So rare earth minerals, you have to understand, are going to be in everything you're using in the digital era. So from the magnets and an EV battery that you're going to need that to power the cars, to what you're seeing, and as you make these semiconductors smaller and smaller, and you're using more advanced materials and refined materials, you're going to need more rare earth minerals. Everything you're doing in a digital front as we move forward is going to be less analog, less steel, more rare earth mineral, more high tech, which makes the next part even harder. And I laughed that I brought up EPA earlier. Didn't think I'd do it twice in the same day. They are responsible for 96 to 98% of the processing of the world's rare earth minerals. So even if you're mining it in Greenland or you're mining it in a part of Africa where they're not under the Belt and Road Initiative and have to provide those rare earth minerals to China, you're still taking the minerals to China to be processed before they can be utilized and put into the manufacturing process. The U.S. sits on rare earth mineral reserves. We are not actively mining rare earth minerals. We do have agreements with countries that mine them that are not China, but we're just buying it, shipping it to China, processing it, and then bringing it back into our own ecosystem. So you're seeing, even as the Biden administration made this really aggressive push to have this EV mandate by 2030, I could have told you on day one that was not realistic given the rare earth mineral situation globally. And China wasn't going to allow that to happen either. So all of it was very wishful thinking, while not recognizing the realities around them on what was actually at play. So I think in terms of the U.S., if you want to be more, enhance your resilience in this space, we have to look at what are the rare earth minerals we have in our reserves? Is it worth the effort to mine them? How do we do that in a way that is clean? And then do we find partner countries to process? If we're not going to be able to clear the hurdle with the EPA to get processing in the United States, and just my personal opinion, I don't think we'll ever get there, what allied countries, what partner countries do we have that have the flexibility to take on a process that's, frankly, the way it's done today is very dirty? So that's something we would have to look at and start, it's fun to have the conversation about domestic security, resilience, and strength, but you can't, I used to tell people, you can't have the international geopolitical conversation without the Homeland Security arm, and the Homeland Security folks can't have their conversation without the geopolitical folks in the room who understand all the other relationships at play. So, you look back at how the NSC, Homeland Security Council were structured over years. I said, when they merged them back together as one, it was kind of breaking down the silo that had to be broken down every day by meetings anyway. So, but no, that is a serious concern. I think that's going to limit the ability to advance. You look at the Internet of Things and creating a more technically advanced society around us, that the limitations are rare earth minerals.
I want to actually stick with you, Bryan, with one more question about fentanyl. So there's an ongoing conversation about, are we going to end up having to sort of lose Americans in a potential confrontation with China as it relates to Taiwan? The truth is we're already losing a lot of Americans because of the fentanyl epidemic, which is largely driven by Chinese precursor chemicals. So obviously the Mexican cartels are helping to get it across the border, but ultimately the sort of origination is with the CCP and with China. How can the U.S. better hold China accountable for these deaths, if you think we should be, and what can be done to halt the flow of fentanyl into the United States?
So first and foremost, I'll go back to the buckets I spoke about in my first opening statement. The social disintegration of this country, fentanyl is a key part of that. That is a weapon in the toolbox. So when you look at the cartels and you look at China, think of it in terms of a business agreement. The cartels are nothing more than a junior partner or a research analyst doing their tactical job. They have a tactical job. They're going to do their tactical job. There's obviously a financial incentive for them to do that, and they're going to go do that. But the managing partner, if you will, is China in this case. So China is the one that's ensuring there's a flow of precursors, while they double talk to the United States at G20 summits that they're going to stop the flow of that, and they're going to limit they're going to crack down on that at the ports. They've done nothing. It's lip service. Meanwhile, it's tacit approval for the organized crime that's accepted within the CCP to kind of continue that flow it has a purpose. Again, it's weaponized to just erode society in the United States, and it's been quite effective. You step back and look at the border, and that's where this is, I would argue, probably north of 85% of fentanyl is coming across the border. There is some coming through other, won't discredit the other shipping routes they have. They have them, they're challenging, and ICE and CBP are working on those. But you look at the border, over 1,000 illegal drone incursions a day occur on the southwest border. Congress gave DHS authority to manage the drone incursion issue last year. DHS has to date not put any policy forward. They're not even promulgating policy. The OGC's office is sitting on it and just saying it's too hazardous to do. Meanwhile, you have Chinese drones being operated by the cartels to conduct espionage, facial recognition of CBP officers. They're getting a pattern of life on the CBP officers, and then they're threatening the CBP officers and their families to get access to certain routes and have people turn their back to allow things to happen. These CBP officers are upstanding U.S. citizens. They're not doing it to gain profit. If it is happening, and I've talked to folks in Texas and Arizona, and there's concerns, it's happening because they're being threatened at the family level, which that's happening. That's encouraged and occurring because the Chinese are empowering this level of intelligence collection by cartels. And we just allow over 1,000 incursions. Everyone got so upset by one balloon, and no one can tell you what was on the balloon as it floated across the country at 60,000 feet. Over 1,000 drone incursions, as low as 5 to 10 feet off the ground, as high as 5,000 feet off the ground. And I can tell you the technology, don't think of it as a DJI drone you're going to go buy at a store, like a big box store. This is the same type of drones that the law enforcement entities are buying that have infrared capabilities, advanced LiDAR, which gets me to my next issue. The civil military fusion, which is funding, again, this fentanyl push, is all being... The challenge of calculating defense spending is because how they structure the government, they have this civil military fusion where everything you're doing is eventually going to go back to their defense. So Hesai LiDAR, recently prohibited by DOD and named or designated as a Chinese military company operating in the United States, is the most prolific seller of LiDAR to the truckers in this country that use it for lane keep assist and other safety features. And I'm not talking about trying to disrupt the safety of the truckers, but every dollar they spend on a Hesai LiDAR is you're feeding that civil military fusion, and you're incurring the cost coming back in through fentanyl. I think states are going to have to be a little serious about enforcing agricultural land use to understand what's happening behind these guarded facilities. It's certainly not something that we're familiar with, and it's not the Oklahoma way. I've heard that from several Oklahoma state legislators. So. But we have to have an understanding of what's happening in our own communities. We have to be eyes wide open about that. And sadly, you're looking at Texas trying to do everything it can to control the flow of the border, which would go a long way in stemming fentanyl. And you have a federal government that's fighting it every step of the way. So that if you're a state, it's got to be a bit disenfranchising to watch that happen.
So there's so much more that we can talk about. We didn't even touch really on pharmaceuticals. We didn't really touch really on illegal police operations, which Michele sort of alluded to. But I want to be sensitive to everybody's time, so this will be my last question. And I always try to end on an optimistic note, although I'm finding it difficult to frame an optimistic question. So I'll ask a sort of pessimistic plus optimistic. So what's one thing that we maybe haven't described in as much depth that sort of keeps you up at night? But then what is one thing that you think is really a good sign that the U.S. is taking this seriously, or that we're making inroads against countering the CCP's influence in the U.S.? And we're going to actually start with Jackie and then end with Bryan. So go ahead, Jackie. Okay. One good thing, one bad thing.
Well, you mentioned pharmaceuticals. I think it's a bad thing that, we may be more vulnerable to coercion from Beijing based on our dependence on them for pharmaceutical inputs and products and PPE than we were even in March of 2020 now. So that's not good. That's not progress. That's dangerous. Deregulation could help. There are things that could help with that situation. But I guess what keeps me or what makes me hopeful is notwithstanding, the brainwashing and the propaganda and interference with, people as young as school students through TikTok and Confucius classrooms and other means. Still, I guess from recent travels and experiences and poll data, I guess my sense is the American people actually do understand, what's at stake, as people were saying, and what the threat is. And there's still a lot of resilience and capability in this country, and ingenuity and love of freedom. So if anything makes me optimistic, it's that. Bryan.
All right. What keeps me up at night, and it's, there's probably a litany of things I could share on that front, but I would say is look at 2019. FBI Director Chris Wray talked about the Chinese cyber threat in terms of the greatest transfer of human wealth through intellectual property theft. You fast forward 5 years to January of 2024, same FBI director is telling you the cyber effects you're seeing take place, the cyber operations China's conducting today are not intellectual property theft aimed. They're not espionage. It's pre-position for war. That is a pre-war positioning of weapon systems on U.S. critical infrastructure. And if that doesn't keep you up at night, I don't know what else will. In terms of something positive I'm seeing is the last 6 months traveling around the country and speaking with states, I've been just truly inspired by the willingness of the state governments, local governments to pick up the mantle and take this fight on at the state and local level. That's truly inspiring. And if we're going to confront this in a meaningful way, that has to happen.
Michele. Bryan's description of the border situation is going to keep me at night now. All right. So I'll start with, I think post-2020, there was a general heightened awareness of the China issue and the China threat. And I think you saw that with public sentiment, right? Polling. You saw it with Congress, right? I think in the Republican majority at the beginning of this Congress, one of the biggest first bipartisan votes was to stand up to the Select Committee on China. And that's a big deal. And then there were, after that, several other, like not selling SPR strategic reserve to China. So I think that's a big deal. The fact that the message has been sent to the American populace, like this is a big issue that everyone should be aware of. But on the flip side, I kind of wish that there was more concern about this, right? And so the reason I say it that way is because like post-2020 should be a rude awakening, but then you still see some instances. I'm going to talk about tutor.com because I think that's kind of been underreported a little bit. And so at 2022, right, tutor.com, just, oh, cool, like they do tutoring for kids, right? And 2022, this company became acquired by China. So it is now owned by China. In fact, if you scroll down to the bottom of the website, it says this is Chinese national company headquartered and based in Hong Kong, China. Also, the Department of Defense has this massive contract with tutor.com, right? So if you go to tutor.com, military families, it says, hey, military families, you can all access this tutoring service for free. It's all paid for by the Department of Defense. And we're like, what? Like, what are we doing here, America, right? Like, our Department of Defense is now turning around to pay this Chinese company to tutor our kid. And I don't know, maybe some of it is tutoring, but again, I'm going to remain skeptical, knowing their ultimate strategic. So I think more obviously needs to be done. And also, by the way, this company, tutor.com, also affiliated with the parent company of ByteDance and TikTok. So kudos to Senator Cotton, who is already, he wrote a letter last month to Secretary Austin, Parents Defending Education, to plug, obviously bias. We put out a list just last week showing that 25 states across the country are using tutor.com in some capacity, whether that's contracts through State Board of Educations or through public libraries that are accessible to children. And so that is going to be our next big push, like, hey, tutor.com, like, we need to find some other domestic safe alternative. Thank you. Bryan.
Thanks. Yeah, I think what keeps me up at night is that it appears that significant portions of our country's leadership are still willing to delude themselves and tell themselves lies about what China is. The salient example being, in order to create some sort of like alleged pause or détente with the CCP and Xi Jinping over the last year, we've now moved into a mode where we're willing to make explicit concessions like lifting sanctions on a genocidal entity of the Chinese government. I think that trickles down and is an incredibly dangerous and negative trend and will hinder any of the other national security actions that we're talking about today. And I really don't understand why, after decades of testing certain theses against the CCP, like they would be changed through their enrichment, et cetera, why we're still willing to believe these things in order for empty promises on fentanyl or empty promises on climate negotiations, et cetera. So that keeps me up at night because it informs all the other things and I think speaks ill of our ability to get them done. On the other hand of the equation, we still can get some of the must-dos done. And recently we have, in completing the Compact of Free Association renewals and 350 plus members of the House of Representatives voting to sever TikTok's ties with the CCP. So there are two sides of that coin, and I think it's a running battle that we'll continue to have to fight.
Great. Well, I'm not sure if I'm ending more optimistic. I think I'm ending worse. But I still really appreciate you guys being here. Thank you so much for everything that you guys are all doing and all of your organizations are doing. Thank you to the Heritage Foundation for co-hosting this event. And if you have not seen our other episodes, you can go to vandenbergcoalition.org and see all of the previous episodes about Chinese Communist Party influence around the world. So thank you very much.